She wrote one word on the divorce papers. Disappointment. Jake Sullivan read it 3 times before he signed his own name underneath it and said nothing at all. For 6 years, the only thing Christine Sullivan knew about her husband's job was that he wore coveralls, smelled like jet fuel, and came home too quiet to talk about his day. She thought that quiet meant empty. She thought there was nothing underneath it. She was wrong. She just never asked the right question. Jake had learned a long time ago that some things, once said out loud, couldn't be unsaid, and some things, once known, couldn't be unknown. So he'd carried the silence like a second uniform, folded and pressed, every single day for 6 years on Holloman Air Force Base. Before we go further, if you're the type who likes stories that don't go where you expect, comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from. Hit that subscribe button and drop a like. It actually matters more than you'd think. Now let's get into what happened the week after the papers were filed. The base was quiet that Tuesday morning. The kind of New Mexico heat that made the tarmac shimmer before 8 a.m. Jake was under the belly of a fuel truck when the first black SUV rolled through the gate. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. Jake Sullivan had a scar that ran from his collarbone to the base of his throat, thin and pale, the kind you'd only notice if you were looking for it. Christine had asked about it exactly once, 4 years into the marriage. Training accident, he'd said. She never asked again. It wasn't a training accident. But it wasn't a lie either. Not exactly. It was a door he'd built and locked from the inside, and he'd gotten so good at keeping it shut that sometimes even he forgot what was behind it. What was behind it was 5 years of a life nobody on this base knew about. A call sign nobody here had ever heard spoken out loud. A cockpit that wasn't a training simulator, and skies that weren't friendly. Jake wiped grease off his hand with a shop rag and watched the SUV roll to a stop 40 yards away. Engine idling, government plates, tinted glass. Around him, the flight line kept moving. Fuel carts, ground crew, the low whine of an F-16 running up on the far apron. Normal Tuesday, except his pulse wasn't normal anymore. He'd felt this exact stillness before. The kind that comes right before something changes permanently. 3 men stepped out. One wore a flight suit with more rank on the collar than Jake had seen walk this base in years. The other 2 flanked him like they were used to clearing rooms, not filling out paperwork. The mechanic beside Jake, a kid named Danny Reed, barely 2 years out of tech school, nudged him. "Hey, Sullivan, you know what that's about?" Jake didn't answer right away. He was watching the officer's face, and something in his own chest was doing a slow, cold drop like an aircraft losing lift. "No idea," Jake said. It was the first lie he'd told all week that actually cost him something. The officer's name tape read Bishop. 2 stars. He walked like a man who'd spent 30 years being obeyed and had stopped noticing it. General Frank Bishop stopped at the edge of the hangar bay, scanned the row of mechanics in stained coveralls, and asked a question that made every head turn but one. "I'm looking for a man who used to go by Reaper." Danny Reed laughed before he caught himself. "Sir, there's no fighter jocks working this line. We're maintenance." Bishop didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. His eyes moved down the row and landed, finally, on Jake, on the grease-streaked forearms, the faded name patch that read Sullivan, the collar just high enough to hide most of a scar that ran from throat to collarbone. "Sergeant Sullivan," Bishop said. Not a question. Jake set down his wrench slow, the way a man sets down something he's not ready to let go of yet. "It's just Jake now, sir. Retired the other name a long time ago." "Nobody retires that name," Bishop said. "They just stop using it out loud." The hangar had gone quiet in the way a room goes quiet when it senses it's standing in the middle of something it doesn't understand yet. Danny Reed looked between the 2 of them, waiting for someone to explain the joke. Nobody did. Bishop's eyes flicked once to the scar at Jake's collar, then back to his face, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, maybe respect, maybe both. "I need 10 minutes, Bishop said. Alone." Jake didn't move at first. 6 years of silence had a weight to it, and letting go of even 10 minutes of that weight felt like admitting something he'd promised himself he never would. "Sir, with respect," Jake said quietly, "that part of me isn't supposed to exist anymore." Bishop's answer came flat and certain. "It exists again as of an hour ago. We have a situation, and you're the only name that came back from the database search. 3 miles from base, in a house that still had half his boxes stacked in the garage, Christine Sullivan sat at the kitchen table with a folder of finalized paperwork and a coffee going cold beside it. She hadn't told anyone yet. Not her sister, not her mother. Some part of her kept waiting to feel relief, and some part of her kept being confused that it hadn't come. 6 years of marriage to a man who fixed trucks for a living, who flinched at fireworks and never explained why, who sat up some nights just staring at the ceiling with his jaw tight like he was listening for something only he could hear. She used to ask what was wrong. Eventually she stopped, because the answer was always the same 3 words, "I'm fine, Chris," delivered in a voice that made it clear the conversation was over whether she liked it or not. She'd wanted a partner who talked to her. Instead, she got a man who came home smelling like jet fuel and said almost nothing, year after year, until the not talking became its own kind of wall between them, brick by brick, one quiet dinner at a time. Disappointment. She'd meant it when she wrote it. She still meant it, mostly, but there was a folder in the garage she hadn't opened in years. Old photographs from before they met. A few award citations with names blacked out by a censor's hand. A single photo of Jake standing in front of an aircraft she didn't recognize, younger, harder-eyed, wearing a patch she'd never seen since. She'd asked about it once. Old unit, he'd said. Doesn't matter anymore. She'd let it go, the way you let go of 100 small doors a person keeps closed, because opening them felt like more work than the marriage was worth by then. Her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number, area code she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. Mrs. Sullivan. The voice on the other end was clipped, official, careful in a way that made her stomach tighten before he said another word. "This is Colonel Marcus Reed, Public Affairs Office. I need to speak with you about your husband." "Ex-husband," Christine said, the word coming out sharper than she meant it to. "Papers went through Friday." "What did he do?" "Total the truck." There was a pause on the line, long enough that she almost thought the call had dropped. "Ma'am, I don't think you have the full picture of who your husband is. Or was." "He's a mechanic," she said, slower now, like she was explaining something to a child. "He fixes fuel trucks." "He's not, whatever this is." "Ma'am, with respect, in about 4 hours your name is going to be listed on a next of kin document for an active recovery operation, and I need to know if you're prepared for what that means." Christine sat very still. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past on the street, ordinary and loud, and completely wrong for the moment she was standing in. "Recovery operation," she repeated. "For a truck mechanic." "Mom." The colonel's voice softened, just slightly, the way people's voices do when they're about to hand someone something heavy. "Your husband has a call sign. It's Reaper. It's attached to a service record that's still partially classified, and General Bishop personally requested him 40 minutes ago for an operation involving an aircraft in distress and a ground team that is currently pinned down. I'm not authorized to tell you more than that over the phone." She opened her mouth to argue, to say there had to be some mistake, some mix-up with another Sullivan on another base. Then she remembered the photograph in the garage, the one with the patch she'd never asked twice about. Jake sat across from General Bishop in a windowless briefing room that still smelled like fresh paint and cold coffee. A single manila folder sat between them, stamped with red letters he hadn't seen in 6 years. "Talk to me," Jake said. "What's the situation?" Bishop slid a photo across the table, satellite imagery, grainy, a stretch of mountainous terrain that could have been a dozen places on Earth. "Special operations element got pinned down 2 hours ago during an extraction gone bad. We've got a downed helicopter, 6 wounded, and an F-16 flight lead who's never flown close air support in a contested valley like this one. He's requesting guidance, and we don't have anyone else who's flown that exact terrain and lived to talk about it." "Except me," Jake said quietly. "Except you." Bishop's eyes didn't leave his face. "Your last stop in that valley was 8 years ago. You're the only living pilot who's flown that terrain profile and made it home. We need your read on the wind shear, the ridge lines, the exact gun positions if they haven't moved, and we need it in the next 20 minutes. Jake's hands, resting flat on the table, did not shake. That, more than anything, was the thing Christine had never understood about him. When everyone else's pulse spiked, his dropped. It always had. I told the Air Force I was done with this 8 years ago, Jake said. I meant it. I know, Bishop said. I signed the paperwork myself. But there are 6 kids down in that valley who don't care what you meant 8 years ago. Jake looked at the photo again, the ridgeline, the terrain he'd once known better than his own house. Something old and quiet woke up behind his eyes, something that had been sleeping under 6 years of oil changes and torque wrenches. Give me a headset, Jake said, and get that flight lead on the line. The comm line crackled to life, and a young voice came through, tight, controlled, but with the particular strain of a pilot flying somewhere far past his comfort zone. This is Havoc 1-1. Who am I talking to? Jake keyed the mic, and for the first time in 6 years, a call sign left his mouth instead of a name. Havoc 1-1, this is Reaper. I flew this valley in '06. Talk to me about your gun sightings. There was a pause on the other end, the particular silence of a young pilot recognizing a name he'd only ever heard in a training brief, spoken like a ghost story. Reaper, copy standby, beat. Sir, is this a joke? Negative, Havoc. No joke. You've got a ridge running east-west about 4 clicks north of the LZ. And if the gun positions haven't moved, you'll have 2 emplacements dug into the north face with overlapping fields of fire. Standard approach gets you killed. You come in low from the south, hug the wash, and you'll be under their fire arc the whole way. Bishop, sitting across the room, watched Jake's face while he spoke, watched the way his voice dropped into something flat and clinical, the same voice Christine used to hear through the bedroom wall on the nights he thought she was asleep, murmuring numbers and coordinates to no one at all. Copy, Reaper, coming in low from the south. A pause. Sir, how do you know the guns haven't moved in 8 years? Jake's jaw tightened just slightly. Some things you didn't explain over an open channel. Some things you didn't explain at all. Because I put half of them there myself, he said. Fly the wash, Havoc. Trust me. Danny Reed stood outside the briefing room door with 3 other mechanics. None of them supposed to be there. All of them unable to leave. Word had moved through the base the way it always does. Fast, half-true, impossible to ignore. There's no way, Danny kept saying, mostly to himself. Sullivan barely talks. Sullivan brought donuts on Fridays. An airman near the door, headset looped around his neck, looked up from a laptop with something like disbelief on his face. I just pulled his file. Half of it's redacted, but the parts that aren't, he stopped, shook his head. Guys, this isn't a mechanic's file. Inside, on the radio, Havoc 1-1's voice had changed. Tighter, faster, the sound of a man flying close to the edge of what he knew. Reaper, taking fire, I've got a Harbank at your 12. Tell me this works. It works, Jake said, voice level as still water. Hold your line, Havoc. Wind's going to push you right at 800 feet. Correct half a click south before you commit, and don't you dare pull up early. Early kills you faster than late. Bishop watched him say it. Watch a man who spent his mornings under fuel trucks speak about wind correction and gun arcs with the calm of someone reciting a grocery list. Outside, Christine's car pulled through the base gate, waved through by a guard who'd been told to expect her. She didn't know yet what she was walking into. She only knew that a colonel's voice on the phone had used the word recovery, and that a photograph in her garage had a patch on it she suddenly needed to understand. She parked outside the building, where every mechanic on base seemed to be standing in a crowd, staring through a window at something none of them could quite believe. Christine pushed through the small crowd at the door, ignoring the looks, until she reached the window Danny Reed and the others were pressed against. Inside, through the glass, she saw her husband. Correction, her ex-husband, as of 4 days ago, sitting straight back at a console she didn't recognize, headset on, a look on his face she had never once seen at their kitchen table. Focused, certain, alive in a way that made something in her chest crack open. Reaper, I'm hit. Losing hydraulic pressure, the voice through a wall-mounted speaker was young, panic-breaking. Havoc, listen to my voice. Jake's tone didn't rise even a half degree. You've got manual reversion on that bird. You've flown in the sim. You can fly it now. Nose down 2 degrees, trim for level, and talk to me about your airspeed. 140 and dropping. That's enough to work with. Breathe. You're not going down today. Christine's hand found the door handle before she decided to open it. Danny Reed stepped aside without being asked, some instinct in him understanding that whatever this was, it belonged to her more than to any of them. She stood in the doorway. Bishop glanced at her once, understood immediately who she was, and said nothing, just gave her a small nod, permission to stay. Jake didn't look up. He couldn't. 6 lives were balanced on the next 90 seconds, and even the sight of his wife, standing in a doorway he'd never expected her to find, couldn't pull his eyes off the console in front of him. She realized, watching him, that she was looking at a stranger, and that the stranger was also, somehow, still exactly her husband. Reaper, gun position confirmed. North Ridge, they're tracking me. I see it, Jake said. On the small monitor in front of him, a grainy drone feed showed the valley from above, a thin trail of tracer fire arcing up toward a shape that was Havoc 1-1's damaged jet. Break right now. Not in 3 seconds. Now. The jet on the screen banked hard, and for 1 full second nobody in the room breathed. Christine's eyes moved from the screen to her husband's hands, steady on the console. No tremor, no hesitation, and back to the screen, where a stranger's life hung on the certainty in his voice. Good, Jake said, quieter now. Good, Havoc. You're clear of the fire arc at your nose toward the LZ and stay low. The ground team needs eyes as much as you need altitude. Bishop exhaled, the first sound of relief anyone had allowed themselves. Ground team confirms extraction bird inbound. We got a window. Jake didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He kept his eyes on the screen, watching the small icon of a damaged jet limp towards safety, the way a man watches something he's terrified to stop watching. Christine finally spoke, her voice small in a room that had briefly forgotten she existed. Jake. He turned, and for the first time in this whole strange hour, something in his flat, controlled expression cracked. Not into relief, not yet, but into something raw and unguarded that she had never once seen at their kitchen table in 6 years of marriage. You called me a disappointment, she said, not as an accusation. As a question she suddenly needed answered. Jake looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. I know, he said. I'll let you believe it. I thought it was safer that way. Bishop cleared his throat, giving them the smallest window of privacy a crowded ops room could offer. Sullivan, we've got maybe 10 minutes before the extraction bird lands, and this whole thing turns into a debrief circus. If there's something you two need to say to each other, say it now. Christine stepped further into the room, past mechanics who were pretending very hard not to listen. 10 minutes, she repeated. You're going to explain 6 years in 10 minutes. No, Jake said. I'm not. Some of it I still can't explain, not because I don't trust you, but because it isn't mine to tell. Half that file Bishop's carrying around still has black bars through it. Then explain the parts that are yours. Jake looked down at his hands, the same hands that a minute ago had talked a wounded pilot through a mountain valley without a single tremor, and that now, in front of her, weren't quite as steady. I flew combat search and rescue, he said. Deep insertion mostly, the kind of missions that don't get a press release. I lost people I can't talk about, in places I'm not allowed to name, and I came home from the last one with a scar. I told you it was a training accident, because the truth was worse, and I didn't know how to hand it to you without breaking something. So you just stopped, became a mechanic, never said a word. I asked for the quietest job on the quietest base I could find, Jake said. I thought if I could just be boring long enough, it would stop being true. Christine's eyes were wet, and she hated that they were, because she still didn't know if this was supposed to feel like relief or grief or both at once. It didn't stop being true, she said. It just stopped being something I knew about. The radio crackled once more, cutting through the moment. Reaper, this is Havoc 1-1. Wheels down. We made it. Jake closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, the only outward sign in the whole hour of how much the mission had actually cost him. Around the room, a ripple of quiet relief passed through the mechanics still crowded at the window, through Bishop, through the airman who'd pulled Jake's redacted file an hour ago and still hadn't fully processed what he'd read. Good copy, Havoc, Jake said, voice finally allowing itself a fraction of warmth. Go home and hug your kid. Copy that, Reaper. And thank you. Whoever the hell you are. Bishop stood, buttoning his jacket, and extended a hand to Jake that Jake took without ceremony. The way two professionals shake hands after a job is finished rather than the way heroes shake hands in movies. 6 lives, Bishop said quietly. You want to tell me again you retired that name for good? I'm still retiring it, Jake said. Today doesn't change that. It just means the Air Force apparently keeps my number on file for emergencies. Bishop almost smiled. We do. Try not to be surprised next time. He turned to Christine, and something in his weathered face softened into something almost gentle. Ma'am, I know this isn't how you expected to spend your Tuesday. For what it's worth, the man you married, whatever paperwork says about him now, just saved 6 lives from a folding chair in a base ops room. That's not nothing. Christine didn't answer right away. She was looking at Jake, trying to reconcile the man in the doorway with the one who used to sit silent at dinner, and finding for the first time that maybe those were never two different men at all. Outside, the crowd of mechanics had thinned but not disappeared, word having spread through the base at the particular speed that only classified secrets seemed to travel. Danny Reed lingered near the hangar entrance, arms crossed, watching Jake walk out of the ops building beside Bishop like he was trying to memorize the sight of it. Sarge, Danny said, using a word he'd never used for Jake before, not once in 2 years of working beside him. Is it true? The stuff going around? Jake stopped. He could have deflected. 6 years of practice had made deflecting easy, automatic, a reflex as natural as breathing. Some of it, Jake said instead. Not all of it. Whatever you heard is probably part true, part rumor, and the truth is usually less dramatic than either. They're saying you saved 6 guys today. Talked a jet down from a hillside gunfight in a valley you used to fly missions in. Jake glanced back at the ops building, at the window where Christine still stood, watching this exchange with an expression he couldn't quite read yet. That part's true, Jake said quietly. Danny didn't say anything else, just extended a hand, and Jake shook it the same plain way he'd shaken 100 hands over 100 fuel truck repairs. No ceremony, no speech, but something had shifted, and both of them knew it. Danny straightened up a half-inch without seeming to notice he'd done it, the way young men do around someone they've just realized deserves it. Jake turned back toward the ops building, toward Christine, toward a conversation that had 6 years of silence behind it and no script to follow. They ended up sitting on the tailgate of Jake's truck in the shade of the hangar, the kind of ordinary spot they might have sat in a decade ago, before either of them knew what the other one was carrying. I'm not asking you to take it back, Jake said finally. The papers, what you wrote. You weren't wrong to feel what you felt. I gave you a marriage with half the walls missing and called it normal. Christine turned the folder of divorce papers over in her hands. She'd brought it without meaning to, tucked under her arm since the car, like she needed something solid to hold on to. I called you a disappointment, she said. I meant it because you never let me in. I didn't know there was a version of you that had 6 lives, depending on his voice today. I didn't know there was a version of you that mattered like that to anyone but me. I mattered to you, Jake said. That was supposed to be enough. I thought if I gave you an ordinary life, a boring one, a safe one, that would be the gift. Instead, it just felt like nothing to hold on to. It wasn't nothing, Christine said, quieter now. It was just incomplete. There's a difference. They sat there for a while without talking, the sun dropping toward the mountains, the base slowly returning to its ordinary rhythm around them. Fuel trucks, radio chatter, the distant whine of an engine somewhere on the flight line. What happens now? Christine finally asked. With the papers. With all of it. Jake looked at her for a long moment, weighing an answer he clearly hadn't planned on needing today. That's not up to the Air Force, he said. That one's just up to us. That evening, Bishop stood in the empty ops room, looking at the same grainy satellite photo that had started the whole day, a folder marked Reaper sitting closed on the table in front of him. An aide knocked, stepped halfway through the door. Sir, we've got a formal commendation forming up for Sergeant Sullivan. Command wants to know if he's willing to have any part of his record declassified for the citation. Bishop was quiet for a moment, thinking of the way Jake's hands hadn't shaken once in an hour that would have broken most men. Ask him, Bishop said, but my guess is he'll say no. Some men don't want the medal. They just want the 6 lives to still be walking around tomorrow. Outside, in the fading gold light over the flight line, Jake and Christine still sat on the tailgate of his truck, not quite finished with the conversation, not quite ready to call it anything yet. A young airman jogged past on some errand, caught sight of Jake, and did something that would have seemed absurd that morning and felt entirely natural by evening. He snapped a clean, sharp salute, the kind reserved for officers and legends, and kept walking without waiting for one back. Jake didn't return it. He just gave a small, tired nod, the same nod he'd give any coworker passing by on any ordinary Tuesday. Christine watched the whole exchange, and something in her chest settled into a shape she didn't have a name for yet. Not quite pride, not quite grief, something adjacent to both. "They're going to write a story about you," she said. "I don't want a story," Jake said. "I just want to go home, wherever that ends up being." She didn't have an answer for that yet either. But for the first time in 6 years, she wanted to find one. The commendation ceremony, when it came 3 weeks later, was smaller than anyone expected. A hangar bay, folding chairs, a flag at half attention in the still morning air. Jake had asked for no press, no base newsletter photo, no speech beyond the minimum required by regulation. Bishop stood at the podium anyway because some things required saying out loud, even to a room that already knew. "Most of you," Bishop said, looking out at rows of mechanics, pilots, ground crew, worked beside this man for years without knowing what he carried. "I want to be clear about something. That wasn't dishonesty. That was discipline. There's a difference, and it's a difference this country doesn't always teach people to see." Danny Reed sat near the front, arms crossed, watching Jake stand stiff and uncomfortable in a dress uniform he clearly hadn't worn in years, the fabric sitting strange on shoulders more used to coveralls. Christine sat 2 rows back, not quite family anymore on paper, not quite a stranger either. The divorce had gone through, technically 3 weeks prior, the ink long dry. But she'd asked to come, and Jake hadn't said no. 6 lives, Bishop continued. 6 families who still have their sons and daughters home for dinner tonight, because a mechanic on this base remembered a valley he flew 8 years ago and never stopped carrying the weight of it. Jake kept his eyes forward, jaw tight, the same stillness Christine had spent 6 years mistaking for emptiness. She understood now it had never been empty. It had been full the entire time, just locked. After the ceremony, in the quiet outside the hangar, Havoc 1-1 found Jake before Jake could slip away the way he usually did. The pilot was younger in person than his voice had suggested over the radio. Maybe 26, a fresh scar of his own along one forearm from the emergency landing, still healing pink. "Captain Ryan Coleman," he said, extending a hand. "Figured I owed you a face to go with the voice." Jake shook it. "Jake Sullivan. Glad you made it down in one piece, Captain." "1.5 pieces," Coleman said, glancing at the healing scar. "I looked up the valley afterward. Read what I could find on the old op. Most of it's still blacked out, but enough came through. You flew that terrain in '06 with half the equipment we've got now." "Different war," Jake said simply. "Same mountains." "I wanted to ask you something," Coleman said, hesitating for the first time since Jake had met him. "Over the radio, you said you put half those gun positions there yourself. What did you mean by that?" Jake was quiet for a moment, weighing how much of an answer a stranger deserved for a question that touched a part of the file still stamped in red. "It means I've made mistakes in that valley that other men paid for," Jake said finally. "And knowing where those positions were wasn't luck. It was memory. The kind you don't get to put down, no matter how many fuel trucks you fix afterward." Coleman didn't ask anything else. Some answers, once given, didn't need following up. 6 months later, Jake stood in the same hangar, in the same coveralls, under the same fuel truck, as if nothing about that Tuesday had ever happened at all. Except it had. Danny Reed called him Sarge now instead of Sullivan, unprompted every time. Young airmen who'd never met him before the ceremony still occasionally slowed their walk past his bay, uncertain whether the quiet man under the truck was really the same Reaper their instructors mentioned in hushed, half-true stories during training briefs. Jake let them wonder. He still didn't correct anybody who got the details wrong. Some habits didn't unlearn easily, even after the secret was mostly out. Christine came by sometimes now. Not as his wife, the papers had made sure of that, but as something new they were both still learning the shape of. Coffee on a Sunday. A phone call on Hard Week. Slow, unhurried, nothing like the 6 years before it. "You could take a desk job," she said once, watching him wipe grease from his hands after a 12-hour shift. "Training command wants you." Bishop's asked twice. "I know," Jake said. "I told him no both times." "What?" Jake looked around the hangar, at the fuel trucks, at Danny Reed running a diagnostic 3 bays down, at the ordinary, unglamorous rhythm of a life he'd chosen on purpose, twice now. "Because this is the part where I get to just be a mechanic," Jake said. "Not the secret, not the legend. Just this. I earned this part too." There was a moment near the end of that 6 months that nobody put in any official report. A young mechanic named Private Sarah Doyle, new to the base, had heard the story secondhand a dozen times by the time she actually worked a shift beside Jake. She was young enough and green enough to ask him directly what nobody else on the line dared to anymore. "Sergeant Sullivan," she said, elbow deep in an engine bay beside him. "Is it true you used to be some kind of legend?" Jake didn't answer right away. He handed her a torque wrench, guided her hand to the right bolt, the way he'd guided 100 young mechanics before her. "I used to fly," he said finally. "That's all legend really means if you strip the word down far enough. Somebody did a job, and it mattered to somebody else, and the story got bigger every time it got retold. But the valley, the 6 guys you saved, that part's true, right?" "That part's true," Jake said. "But so is this part." He nodded at the engine in front of them, at the grease on both their hands, at the ordinary Tuesday unfolding around them exactly like every other Tuesday had for 6 years before that one. "Legend's just a word people use for the parts of your life they didn't get to see," Jake said. "It doesn't make the rest of it less real." Sarah Doyle didn't fully understand what he meant. She would, eventually, the way most people who worked beside Jake Sullivan long enough eventually did. Bishop retired the following spring, and at his own small ceremony, smaller even than Jake's had been by Bishop's own insistence, he asked for exactly one guest outside his official chain of command. Jake showed up in civilian clothes, the first time anyone on either base had seen him out of uniform in years. "You didn't have to come," Bishop said. "You didn't have to ask for me," Jake said. "Figured that made us even." They stood together at the edge of the small gathering, 2 men who'd spent one impossible hour in an ops room and had barely spoken since, watching a flag come down for the last time on Bishop's command. "You ever regret it?" Bishop asked, going back that day, answering the call. Jake thought about it honestly, the way he thought about most things, slowly, and without performing an answer for anyone else's benefit. "No," he said. "I regret waiting 8 years to find out I still had it in me. I don't regret the day I finally used it." Bishop nodded, satisfied with an answer that sounded exactly like the man he'd pulled out from under a fuel truck a year earlier. "Your wife," Bishop said. "Ex-wife. She's still around?" "She's around," Jake said, and something in his voice, quiet as it was, carried a warmth that hadn't been there the day Christine had first walked into that ops room holding a folder of divorce papers she no longer quite knew what to do with. "Good," Bishop said. "Every legend deserves one person who knew him before he was one." A year to the day after the divorce papers were signed, Jake and Christine sat on that same tailgate outside the hangar, the light falling gold across the flight line exactly the way it had that Tuesday. Neither of them had said the word remarriage out loud yet. But there was a ring in Jake's truck cab, wrapped in a shop rag instead of velvet box, because some habits, quiet ones, understated ones, never fully left him. "You know what the strangest part of this year was?" Christine asked. "Which part?" Jake said. "There were several strange parts. Watching you become a legend to everyone else on this base," she said, "while you were exactly the same man to me. Quieter, maybe. Softer around the parts you used to keep locked. But the same man." "I was always the same man," Jake said. "You just didn't have the whole file before." "No," she agreed. "I didn't." He reached into the truck cab, retrieved the shop rag, and unwrapped it slowly, the way he unwrapped most things in his life, without ceremony, without performance, just quiet certainty. "I'm not asking you to erase the papers," he said. "I'm asking if you'd consider a second file. One where I don't keep so many things locked. Christine looked at the ring, then at him, then at the flight line stretching gold and quiet in front of them. An ordinary Tuesday evening on an ordinary Air Force base that had, exactly 1 year ago, stopped being ordinary for exactly 1 hour. Yeah, she said finally. I consider that. The wedding, when it came that autumn, was as small and unceremonious as everything else in Jake's life had become since the valley. A backyard, folding chairs, Danny Reed serving as best man in a suit that fit worse than his coveralls ever had. General Bishop came, retired now, standing a little straighter than his civilian clothes suggested he needed to. Captain Ryan Coleman flew in from his new posting, scar on his forearm faded to a thin white line now, matching in some strange way the one on Jake's collarbone. Sarah Doyle came too, the young mechanic who'd asked Jake directly about the legend. Now 6 months further into a career she credited partly to a torque wrench and a quiet conversation over an engine bay. Nobody made speeches about combat search and rescue. Nobody mentioned classified files or gun positions or a valley 8 years and one impossible afternoon in the past. It was, by design, an ordinary wedding for two ordinary people who happened to have one extraordinary Tuesday between them. Christine wore her mother's ring alongside the new one. Jake wore civilian clothes for the second time in years, uncomfortable in the collar, comfortable in everything else. Second file, she whispered to him during the vows, echoing his own words back to him. Second file, he agreed. Fewer locked doors this time. Outside the small gathering, unnoticed by most of the guests, an old shop rag sat folded in the glove compartment of Jake's truck. Empty now, its job long finished, kept anyway because some things earned the right to be kept. Bishop found a quiet moment at the reception to pull Jake aside, away from the noise of the small crowd, near a fence line at the edge of the yard. I never told you the full story, Bishop said. Why I came looking for you specifically that day. There were 2 other names on that short list. Better records, on paper. Cleaner files. Why me then? Jake asked. Because your file had a note in the margin from your last commanding officer. 8 years old, Bishop said. It said, and I'm quoting it exactly, "This man will answer if you ever need him." He won't want to. He'll answer anyway. Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the small gathering behind them. Christine laughing at something Danny Reed had said, Coleman showing Sarah Doyle a photo on his phone, an ordinary scene built entirely out of one extraordinary afternoon. Guy was right, Jake said finally. Guy usually was, Bishop said. You planning on staying a mechanic forever? Or is there a version of you that eventually comes back around? There's a version of me that already came back around once, Jake said. I think I've got exactly one of those in me. I used it. I'm not planning on needing a second. Bishop nodded, accepting the answer the way he'd learned to accept most of Jake's answers, without pushing, without needing more than what was given. Good, Bishop said. Every legend deserves an ending where nobody needs him to be one anymore. 2 years later, Danny Reed made staff sergeant, and Sarah Doyle transferred to flight training, chasing a dream she credited, in part, to a quiet man who'd once told her that legend was just a word for the parts of a life other people hadn't seen yet. Jake stayed exactly where he was. Same hangar, same fuel trucks, a new wedding ring on his hand, a phone that now had Christine saved instead of ex-wife, do not answer, a scar at his collarbone that had, over time, stopped being a locked door and started being just a scar. Bishop called occasionally, mostly to check in, sometimes to pass along a rumor of another young pilot flying through unfamiliar terrain who might benefit from an old voice on the radio. Jake always listened. He rarely said yes. But the offer, each time, was made with the understanding that if the day ever truly required it, 6 lives on the line, no one else who remembered the terrain, he would answer. He'd already proven that once. Everyone who mattered already knew it. Christine asked him once late at night whether he missed it, the flying, the call sign, the version of himself that used to matter to strangers in a way most people never get to matter to anyone. No, Jake said, and meant it completely. I like being the guy under the truck. I like being the guy you know everything about now. I spent 8 years being a legend nobody could see. I'd rather spend the rest of it being a husband everybody can. If this story hit home, do me a favor. hit that like button and drop a comment telling me, would you have forgiven the silence the way Christine did, or would 6 years of not knowing have been too much to come back from? That's the real question at the center of every story like this one. Not whether the hidden hero turns out to be extraordinary. They usually do. But whether the people closest to them can forgive not being let in sooner, once they finally understand why the door was locked in the first place. Jake Sullivan never wanted a medal. He never wanted a title, a parade, or a chapter in anyone's memory but his own. He wanted exactly what he built at the end of all of it: a hangar, a wrench, a wife who finally had the whole file, and an ordinary Tuesday that got to stay ordinary again. Subscribe for more unforgettable military and aviation stories like this one. The quiet ones, the hidden ones, the ones that remind us some of the bravest people we know are standing right next to us, wearing coveralls instead of medals, saying nothing at all. We'll see you in the next story.